If you want to understand how the machinations of a religious organization gone bad work and how people behind the scenes manipulate systems that are intended to give the public freedom and autonomy, turning them towards a glut for money and power, allow me to offer you my humble admission. At the end of last year, I published the first part of my research into a controversial and powerful conservative Catholic sect, the Sodalitium Christianae Vitae, or the Sodality of Christian Life, which was a Peruvian Catholic society that unfortunately devolved into a cult of personality around its fanatical, narcissistic leader, Luis Fagari. I took you down the winding, twisting rabbit hole of depravity and sadomasochism that Fagari and his fanatics left in their wake, and introduced you to the brave men and women who fought tirelessly to expose the crimes and abuses that were committed and protected within the SCV. That episode focused primarily on the creation and history of the organization and the efforts of former members, investigative journalists, and human rights activists to seek justice and accountability for a group of people whose motivations appeared to be an insatiable greed for money and power. While you do not have to watch part 1 before you watch part 2 today, there is a lot of context and background information that might give what we are going to be discussing today more weight, so you should check that out at some point, either before or after this. When I was researching this organization and all of the fallout surrounding it, it quickly became clear that there were some important aspects of this story that deserved a little bit more attention. In addition to human rights abuses, the now defunct SCV has been accused of some very serious crimes, which could have international implications for a number of countries, including the United States. Today, I will be taking you through as much of the story as I could piece together, and I won't bury the lead here too much. I think that this whole situation opens up an interesting conversation about the rights of regular, non-religious people when interacting with people who are supposed to be representing a religious organization like the Catholic Church. Because one thing that I've learned from my research is that lay people do have rights within the Catholic Church, but I don't think that most of them know that, and I'm starting to feel like that's a pretty big deal. So make sure you hit that like button, sit back, and get comfortable. It's time to talk about transnational crime, fraud, and trafficking. My name is Beck Griffin, and you're watching The Deep Dive Project. Deep Dive Project is my venture in independent citizen journalism. I want to be very upfront about the fact that I am not a journalist by background or education, but I don't have to be in order to discuss and opine about matters of public concern. My primary goal here is to raise awareness about human rights, to destigmatize important conversations about human health and safety, and to empower my audience with information and a desire to learn more and to self-educate. We live in a world of near limitless connectivity, with the answers to our questions often as close as a few internet queries away. And while I am not here to fearmonger or raise alarm, it is not hyperbole to say that ignorance is a luxury that we and billions of innocent people simply can no longer afford. I need to issue a few quick statements before we begin. As with all of the work that I publish, some viewers may find today's topics disturbing and upsetting, and viewer discretion is always advised. Everything that I am presenting today is based on information that is publicly available on the World Wide Web, and it is a representation of my opinion of the SCV organization and the people connected to it, and everything that I say is alleged unless otherwise proven in a court of law. All of my references are linked in a source document down in the episode description. Do not contact, attempt to contact, or harass anyone mentioned in this video on behalf of me, yourself, or anyone else. I have done my best to substantiate any claims concerning legal proceedings or scandals, but even so, the information that I present today should not be considered comprehensive or complete. I am sure that I missed a detail here and there because this is just a very complicated situation, but I did my best. So, with all of that said, let's turn our attention to the matter at hand. It's time to learn about land trafficking. So land trafficking is a term that I was unfamiliar with prior to doing the research for this episode. I found a research paper that was published in 2016 titled Land Trafficking, Migration, and Conservation in the No Man's Land of Northeastern Peru by authors Noga and Sam Shawnee. In their paper, they included a flowchart illustrating the two different types of land trafficking. And while I read the abstract for this paper, take a look at the flowchart on your screen. I will use their definition of land trafficking, which is the usurpation, illegal appropriation, and commerce of lands, which is closely linked with rural, and urban-rural migration and can be seen as an activity that organizes and facilitates migration. Land trafficking has rarely been examined in any detail, and a search of academic databases failed to find publications specifically related to this activity. My background is actually in environmental science, and I haven't gotten to flex my conservation muscle here on the Deep Dive Project nearly as much as I would like, so finding the intersection between human rights and environmental conservation, my two passions, at the center of this situation is a moment that I wanted to make note of, but I digress. According to Shawnee and Shawnee, Peru and especially its northeastern regions are considered a global conservation priority because of high biodiversity and the acute threats that they face. Despite the Peruvian state's declared intention to end forest loss, deforestation is on the rise. This is in part due to rural and urban-rural migration to forest frontier zones. This migration is often organized and led by land traffickers. Land trafficking exists at different scales and can be highly lucrative. Loopholes in Peruvian laws, conflicting policies, and institutional inefficiencies impede effective confrontation of land trafficking and in some cases even encourage it. Corruption plays an essential role in facilitating this trade. Although local people are often aware of the problems related to land trafficking, their ability to control it is greatly impeded by social factors and by the dangers of confronting organized criminals. Land trafficking is seldom studied, but has great environmental and social implications and must be addressed both on academic and practical levels in order to confront biodiversity loss related to migration to forest frontiers. If you are interested in reading that paper in its entirety, you can find it linked in the source document below. I do want to stress how important this issue is for reasons that go deeper than what may be immediately obvious. This is something that the authors of this paper recognize and emphasize as well, writing that the regions of the Amazonas and San Martin in northeastern Peru lie at the heart of the tropical Andes biodiversity hotspot, considered the most biodiverse region on Earth. The tropical Andes are incredibly biodiverse and are home to an estimated 30,000 vascular plant species, half of which are endemic, meaning that they occur nowhere else in the natural world, 584 species of birds, including 69 endemic, and 75 species of mammal, including 5 endemic monotypic taxa. Biodiversity hotspots are regions that have been identified as being particularly biologically rich. These hotspots are assessed and identified using 2 strict criteria. It must have at least 1,500 vascular plants as an endemic species, which again are species that are not found anywhere else in the world outside of this one biodiverse hotspot, and it must have 30% or less of its original natural vegetation, meaning that it is threatened. Around the globe, there are 36 regions that currently qualify as hotspots, which might sound like a fair number, but their habitat only represents 2.5% of the Earth's land surface. Yet they support more than half of the world's endemic plant species and approximately 43% of all endemic bird, mammal, reptile, and amphibian species. So the impact and benefit that these hotspots have cannot be overstated. Biodiversity underpins all of life here on Earth by supporting and enabling the myriad ecosystem services that life depends on in order to thrive, like clean air, clean water, arable, fertile soils, nutrition, and sustenance. According to Conservation International, these biodiversity hotspots, which keep in mind are necessary and threatened, happen to overlap with the same locations that most benefit human life. Our success as a species is inextricably connected to the success of the natural world, and And this is particularly true in developing parts of the world where vulnerable populations rely on up to 35% of the services these hotspots provide just for their survival. Sadly, as is the case for many of these locations in the Peruvian region, they suffer from some of the worst rates of deforestation in all of Peru, a problem that has been exacerbated by land trafficking, immigration, insecure property rights, and intense mining activities, coupled with a general lack of government oversight. In essence, the perfect recipe for an environmental and domestic catastrophe. It is important to note that this is not a solely Peruvian problem, as there have been high-profile cases of land trafficking throughout Latin America. There is quite a bit of historical context behind this issue, which I want to acknowledge, although I am not going to be getting into all of the details today. None of this happened in a vacuum, and at least in Peru's case, Shawnee and Shawnee identified political and economic instability coupled with mass migration of rural populations to urban centers during the 1950s and 60s as the origin of some of Peru's land trafficking issues present day. Again, because I am not doing the historical context justice, if you want to know more about this subject, I think that this research paper that I've been referencing is a good place to start, and you can read it for yourself down in my source document. Unsurprisingly, land trafficking has featured in Peruvian news headlines for quite some time. I found a January 2015 article titled "How Corruption Feeds Land Trafficking in Latin America," which detailed how a Peruvian businessman and lawyer named Rodolfo Orellana ran a criminal network that stole Peruvian land for more than a decade, earning nearly $100 million and acquiring at least $1 billion in properties in Peru. This was accomplished via a network of fake documents and frontmen, fake consulting firms, rental agencies, and settlement companies, all designed to create the appearance of a legal claim to private and public land. Marguerite Colley, the author of this article, notes that the means used to unethically acquire this land, which are often violent, rely on connections with government officials who can provide land traffickers with a veneer of legitimacy. And although a number of countries have enacted laws intended to govern conservation, land rights, and land trafficking, Peru has modified its criminal code and established a prison sentence for those convicted of illegally trading or selling land. It has been much more difficult to target and dismantle the corrupt networks facilitating fraudulent land sales. Legislation and policy directed at this issue is underway, but it's still in its infancy. As an interesting aside, I wanted to know how significant of an issue land trafficking is in my own country, the United States. Based on a preliminary Google search, it doesn't appear to be much of an issue at all, which admittedly I am not surprised by, given that 60% of U.S. land is owned by private individuals and corporations, so the laws and regulations governing land use are significantly more robust here. The only mention I saw of it was within the broader context of efforts to combat human trafficking. For example, in this 2023 article, land trafficking is mentioned once on page 16, and it implies to me in this case, land trafficking refers to something different than what we're talking about in Latin America. Before we continue, I wanted to take a quick moment to express my sincere and heartfelt gratitude to my subscribers and supporters for giving my work your time and attention, buying me coffees, giving me your thoughtful feedback, and sharing your experiences with me in comment sections and DMs, and for making it very clear that something as simple as sitting here and giving a voice to these experiences and situations can be far more profound and liberating than most people realize. So thank you. Details to connect with me and support my work are linked down below. So, with all of that very necessary context out of the way, we have now come to how the SCV has become connected to land trafficking and fraud. Those of you who saw part 1 of my SCV research will be familiar with Paolo Ugaz, the Peruvian investigative journalist with a long history reporting on human rights issues in Peru, most recently those which occurred within the SCV. She has been hot on the organization's tail for decades at this point. She co-wrote Half Monks, Half Soldiers with former member survivor of the Sodalitium, Pedro Salinas. And in that book, Salinas reported that during his time in the SCV during the 1980s, he witnessed what he described as sectarian characteristics and was the victim of mistreatment and abuse, including sexual abuse, on the part of the SCV's founder, Fagari. The book also featured 30 different testimonies of abuses that occurred over almost 30 years at the hands of the same people who tormented and abused Salinas, including Fugari. Ugaz described the SCV as an ideological knee-jerk reaction within the Catholic Church to liberation theology, which emphasizes a church of the poor and greater social justice. You can learn more about all of this in the first part of my SCV deep dive. But in regard to land trafficking specifically, Ugaz investigated allegations of criminal activity and the purchase of a large swath of land in Piura by the San Juan Bautista Civil Association, which had ties to the SCV on allegations that companies affiliated with the SCV had used the legal system to harass peasant farmers and catecheos in order to force their eviction. There was also the use of violence and murder carried out by criminal gangs hired by an SCV-affiliated company and bringing criminal charges based on false accusations of terrorism, usurpation, and invasion. Despite the SCV's insistence that nothing was amiss, the Peruvian State Attorney General's office opened an investigation in 2015 into the entire economic movement of the SCV. The Archbishop of Piura, Jose Ugueran, was implicated in all of this as well, since it all happened in his diocese. Ugaz was quoted saying, "It's a big slap in the face to the Peruvian Episcopal Conference that they've let everything happen, and that there have been archbishops who haven't done anything. It's very serious." Because of her reporting and their book, Ugueran sued Ugaz and Salinas both in 2018 for defamation, seeking around $100,000 in fines and fees, as well as jail time for what he considered to be slanderous statements about his honor and reputation. He would drop this suit a year later, and in 2024, he resigned from his position as Archbishop of Piura ahead of the release of a Vatican investigation into allegations of sexual and psychological abuses and financial corruption in the SCV. Come to find out, that was probably the first smart thing that Ugueran did since being implicated in land trafficking, because concerns about financial irregularities within the SCV in Ugueran's archdiocese were revealed to be among the reasons Pope Francis ordered an investigation in the first place. And yes, I am aware that I may not be pronouncing Jose's last name correctly, perfectly, but given what he's been implicated in, given what we're talking about, I don't really care. Amongst these irregularities, there were possible exploitations of the Concordat, a church-state agreement granting tax exemptions to Catholic charities and missions, so tax fraud. In an article published on Crux, it was written, "Under the Concordat, whatever profit the church earns must be reallocated to social and charitable networks that benefit Peruvian society. This allocation has not happened in the SCV's case." Speaking to Crux, Ugaz referenced her decade of investigation into the SCV's financial network, saying the group built an economic portfolio believed to be worth hundreds of millions, in which both the money-making projects and the companies receiving the profits were owned and managed by members of the SCV. According to Ugaz, the SCV has run various money-making activities throughout the years, such as selling books and CD players, running mines, schools, and agricultural companies, and selling real estate and select internet and website services, including the establishment of the website for the Archdiocese of Lima under the then Archbishop of Lima, Cardinal Juan Luis Cipriani. And I go into quite a bit of detail into Cipriani's connections to the SCV as well as Opus Dei in the first part of this project. So you should go and check that out if you are not familiar with Cipriani's track record up to now. But the hen that laid the golden egg for the SCV, you guys said, was its project involving cemeteries. In total, you guys said that the SCV-run companies established 9 cemeteries in dioceses and archdioceses throughout Peru, structuring them as missions, and that this legal status guaranteed they received tax exemptions for funeral and burial services, generating up to 30 to 40% more profit. In the Church's Code of Canon Law, a mission is defined as a place where religious activities take place but does not yet have the characteristics of a parish. What a mission specifically consists of is not clearly defined in canon law, but the term is usually applied in traditional missionary contexts, such as remote communities of the Amazon. It is considered unusual for the designation to be given to a cemetery, and observers say the decision to do so would have required approval at some level in the Vatican. So what I would like to know is who in the Vatican helped the SCV create these fake missions. Quote, the first SCV-run cemetery was established by the Diocese of Lurin in the early 2000s by then Bishop Jose Ramon Gurruchaga Ezama in partnership with the two SCV-run organizations, the ACSJB and the St. Ignatius Foundation, which together established the Catholic Mission on Cemetery Park of Remembrance. Ugaz said that the ACSJB maintained 50% control of the cemetery and sold the other 50% to the St. Ignatius Foundation, established in Panama in 1997 under the name of Pusan by SCV priest Jamie Bertol before it was later renamed. The diocese, Ugaz said, received not even a percentage of the direct profits, with the understanding that should the bishop need funds, SCV members or individuals would contribute. So these were not the only SCV individuals or foundations implicated in tax fraud. Like I said earlier, Ugaz has been investigating the SCV for years, and in November of 2021, she co-wrote a piece in La Repubblica which revealed, among other things, that the SCV prosecutor before the Holy See at that time, a man named Enrique Elias Dupuy, was the treasurer of the offshore Santa Rosa Foundation, which together with Providential Incorporated was moving money from the SCV in Peru to offshore accounts. After all, they had to do something with all of the revenue that their various ventures were generating. Now, if you have seen my episode about the Legion of Christ, you may recall I mentioned a massive leak of information called the Pandora Papers. In case you missed it, though, the Pandora Papers refers to the more than 11.9 million financial records containing 2.94 terabytes of confidential information from 14 offshore service providers and, critically, information on more than 29,000 beneficial entities, the owners of those offshore assets. In the Legion of Christ case, it was revealed that the organization had made multi-million-dollar investments in real estate through offshore companies or trusts intended to disguise the owners' identities. But because of the leak, everything got exposed, and the Legion of Christ was not the only Catholic organization with financial chicanery laid bare. The SCV was also exposed in the alleged creation of offshore accounts linked to the Sodality Providential Group Incorporated, which I mentioned a moment ago, and Alma Minerals Limited. The SCV allegedly moved money from Peru to Panama, but following the 2021 Pandora Papers leak, Panama chose to pursue legal action against those mentioned in the leak, which is understandable because the Pandora Papers was preceded by the Panama Papers in 2016 and the Paradise Papers in 2017, so Panama was already on the radar and not in a good way. While I was writing and researching this episode, I found a Wikipedia page with lists of data breaches, including what was exposed and how. I'll link it down below in case you want to take a look at it. It is Wikipedia, so take it with a grain of salt, but something interesting that I read stated that 95% of data breaches come from government, retail, or technology industries. Each breach seems to be worse than the one before it. The earliest leak that I saw happened in 2004, and just 510,000 records were exposed, which is a lot. But fast forward to 2018, 4.5 billion records were exposed. And in 2024, just a few short years later, a data breach dubbed the mother of all breaches was revealed, in which 26 billion records were leaked. I found a report from Experian which stated that according to IBM's 2024 cost of a data breach report, the global average cost of a breach rose 10% from 2023, now standing at $4.88 million US. Add this to the ancillary costs of lawsuits such as the $30 million settlement in September against DNA testing company 23andMe over a genetic data breach that exposed the personal information of 6.4 million customers in 2023. And this is obviously a modern problem that would not exist to the extent that it does, except that our fates have become sealed with the release of the first home computer and then the smartphone. People now live half, if not more, of their lives online, which is a trend that is unlikely to reverse anytime soon. Nearly everything has gone digital, and what hasn't soon will. Critical, personal, and private information needs to be kept safe and secure under our own control. control, which is becoming more and more difficult with each new tech and AI development. One problem out of many is that the same safeguards intended to protect the innocent can also shield the unscrupulous, and just so is the case with offshore banking because there are differences between confidentiality, privacy, and public interest, and all three must be balanced. Now, this would be a fantastic place for me to shoe in an Aura or some sort of VPN sponsorship, but alas, I don't have anything like that. No one seems interested in sponsoring me talking about these issues, which is a little concerning. So if you think that this is an important conversation and you think that the topics that I am covering are important topics that need to be discussed, please consider subscribing if you have not already. And if you would like to buy me a coffee or send me a super chat, I would be very appreciative, but that is of course totally optional. Just being here, watching my content, liking, and subscribing goes so far. Anyway, so after the Panama Papers leak and Panama's decision to react, the SCV moved its Panama-based holding company Providential Group Incorporated to Denver, Colorado in 2016, adding the Santa Rosa Foundation as well. All three of those entities now share the same street address at the SCV-run Holy Name Parish in Englewood, Colorado. The St. Ignatius Foundation was apparently dissolved in the wake of moving to Denver. Based on what I read on publications like La Repubblica and the National Catholic Register, the SCV declined to comment on any of this until just last year when a spokesman for the organization told Crux that the SCV was denying any wrongdoing and was in full cooperation with the authorities. In that same article, a Catholic cardinal named Ghirlanda was identified as a person Pope Francis had specifically chosen to investigate the SCV, but Ghirlanda called that fake news, so I don't really know what that's about. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that at the time that this article was published, the SCV was still alive and kicking, and so maybe it was putting up a fight to try to save face or recoup or whatever, and that's why you see weird conflicting quotes and takes like this. I have no way of knowing for sure, but that's just kind of how it feels to me now in hindsight. Regardless, being exposed as a perpetrator of something as predatory and evil as land trafficking clearly did not cast the Sodalitium in a positive light. Because of the investigations that began in 2015, the Sodality would initiate a series of changes which essentially reversed the cemetery contracts in 2021. The SCV continued to deny that it had violated the Concordat governing tax exemptions for Catholic charities and missions. According to them, the cemeteries had merely been intended for local churches to have their own cemeteries and to carry out active evangelization from them. But I'm not exactly sure how that was supposed to work in practice because it seems counterintuitive to me that any sort of act of anything could be generated from a plot of land full of dead people. But I digress. Apparently, the SCV received responsibility for the cemeteries so that it could fulfill its purpose of ensuring their sacred nature. But that sacred nature apparently couldn't govern itself, so of course they had to appoint a board of directors, and so it goes. Investigative work on Ugaz's part revealed that the SCV's empire building was enabled via assistance from prominent members of the Peruvian elite who were friends of the movement, including a former Peruvian president and the daughter of another. In 2021, it was becoming abundantly clear that all was not up to snuff with the SCV. An article published on La Repubblica and written by Reza Arroyo and Paola Ugaz compared the SCV to a two-sided coin, with Fagari's abuse and cult of personality on one side and alleged bad business practices and tax fraud on the other, primarily led by this Jamie Manuel Berto Gomez character. The immense wealth that the SCV had managed to accumulate over about 50 years at that point was significant and not something it seemed to want the Vatican to become aware of as it was investigating them for human rights abuses, adding another reason as to why it moved all of its offshore assets and finances from Panama to the United States. Exactly how much money we're talking about here isn't perfectly clear, of course, but in an article from the AP, Pedro Salinas was quoted saying that it could exceed $1 billion. Of course, on paper, everything looked okay because the majority of the SCV's assets are in private companies out of the Vatican's reach and disguised through a system of frontmen and proxies, so the organization appears to have nothing but but we know that that isn't true. This flowchart illustrates how everything was mapped out, with the greatest and most significant question still outstanding. What was the final destination and purpose for these hundreds of millions of dollars? In 2023, the Peruvian state prosecutor opened a preliminary inquiry into 3 SCV members for alleged money laundering with offshore companies based on leaked data from the Pandora Papers. The SCV doubled down on denying that it had done anything wrong and claimed that it was invested in cooperating with the law and trusting that justice would prevail. That same month, an article on Crux revealed that the Vatican had made the decision to ask American authorities for help amid an international financial scandal involving a new suppressed Catholic organization with tentacles in Peru, the Vatican, and the United States. Subtle. And I wonder who that could be. Elise Ann Allen wrote that following the receipt of some detailed correspondence warning that individuals linked to the SCV were attempting to use the church-state concordat to gain tax breaks, with the resulting funds being carefully funneled to holding companies in the U.S., the Vatican prepared to send information pertaining to allegations of international money laundering and financial fraud on the part of the SCV to American authorities. Over the course of a decade, investigative journalists and Peruvian prosecutors uncovered a financial operation involving fraud against the Peruvian and North American states, allegedly done with assistance from some church representatives who, as of now, are still unnamed. One of the Vatican officials who received the initial correspondence, Monsignor Jordi Bertomeu, stated during an interview that the American justice system will focus its attention on this case. When you're dealing with a group that is not only abusive, but also a mafia group, and not just on a small scale, we're talking about $1 billion stolen dollars, the difficulties are greater. The Vatican has no interest in hiding this plot and intends to provide U.S. authorities with all of the relevant information. At this point, it's worth remembering that there is likely another reason why the SCV wanted to hide its fortune, namely the victims of the organization and its leadership. While some victims have received some sort of modest compensation prior to the SCV's suppression, unfortunately that has not been true for everyone. And if you saw part 1, you may recall that one of the outstanding questions that I was left with at the end was how and when the SCV's victims will be compensated or taken care of. In reporting from Crux, it was revealed that according to public records, funds from the fraudulent cemeteries were transferred to a trust allegedly to keep the money from being used to compensate the SCV's victims. The organization was blasted for employing a pseudo-reparation process that left victims out in the cold unless they were willing to sign NDAs, and in those cases, the compensation was paltry, at best. At this point, any remaining hope for justice and reparations may have to come from the U.S. civil justice system or some sort of international court, because thanks to the SCV's wealth being locked away in civil organizations, it is absolutely impossible to recover and therefore completely safe from justice, law, and order. Bertomeu was quoted saying that we trust the American justice system more where institutions function despite political problems because there is an effective separation of powers. That is a separation that is coming under increasing fire, which you will know about if you are subscribed to my Substack, Beck Griffin and the Deep Dive Project. I've been researching and writing about the assault on the church-state separation that is currently happening in this country. So who knows how much longer the U.S. justice system will remain a bit better than justice systems everywhere, but as an American citizen living here now through the things that we are living through, hearing something like that just makes me go, yikes. Because it tells me how bad things actually are, that the U.S. justice system would be the Vatican or the victims' best hope. If that is the case, the victims and anyone who is watching and waiting to see what will happen will have to be patient, because the wheels of American justice churn slowly these days, if at all. But there has been some progress in Peru, which I would be remiss not to mention. If you recall, there had been allegations of criminal activity in the purchase of a large swath of land in Piura by the San Juan Bautista Civil Association, which had ties to the SCV, on allegations that companies affiliated with the SCV had used the legal system to harass peasant farmers and catequeos in order to force their eviction. During summer 2025, the 4th Criminal Court of Piura ruled in favor favor of the farmers after they were able to present title deeds dating back to the 1980s in what was referred to as a victory for all who defend their territory against abuse. For the Vatican's part, Pope Leo has made it clear in statements, anyway, that he is aware of the situation with the SCV, including the reality of its victims. Since October of 2025, he has had a series of meetings with survivors of abuse and victims advocates, and thus far, Pope Leo has repeatedly voiced his support for journalists and human rights advocates and would appear to be in a state of shared commitment to justice, healing, and real change. And he does have a bit of a positive track record from his time as Bishop of Chiclayo, Peru, for taking abuse cases seriously, so a lot of faith is being placed in him, and many people are hoping that he will be the Pope who will fundamentally alter how the Catholic Church responds to victims of clerical abuse going forward. We need optimism right now, so I am not interested in trying to bash any of these hopes, but I have to acknowledge that I have been extremely critical and frankly unimpressed with how the Catholic Church and its various pontiffs over the decades have chosen to respond to issues like what we have discussed today, and that includes Pope Leo. And while I can appreciate that the task before him is immense, the bar is in hell at this point as far as I'm concerned. And I judge people, particularly people in positions of power and influence, by the fruits of their labor and effort, not by block quotes that end up regurgitated and plastered across sympathetic news feeds. At this current juncture, with what is happening in our society, and in my country in particular, I am uninclined to give any leader or representative the benefit of the doubt. Please hear me when I say that I would be happy to be wrong. I would be thrilled, ecstatic, if all of the misgivings that I have turned out to be false, and that Pope Leo and all of these other religious leaders around the world, Catholic and otherwise, truly were ready and willing to make substantial, sustainable change. But anyone can talk, guys, and anyone can show up at a meeting. It really doesn't mean anything. I want to see progress from the top down to eradicate systems and institutions that unfairly favor the powerful and greedy and that perpetuate, aid, and abet abuse rather than stopping it in its tracks. It would be great to start seeing churches empowering its members to uphold safe and positive environments for all, and that includes equipping them with the knowledge and resources necessary to fully and authentically engage with the life of the church. And I think why that has failed to happen up to now is important and something that we all, and particularly current practicing Catholics, need to start thinking about. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing and sharing this deep dive with someone that you know. Also, remember that details to learn more about my work, connect with me on social media, and support my endeavors are all linked down below. In addition to YouTube, you can find Beck Griffin and the Deep Dive Project on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Substack, and pretty much anywhere podcasts live. If you listen at any of these places, please be sure to leave a 5-star rating or comment. It helps my content reach more people. If you feel like hanging around, go and check out some of the other playlists and content over on my channel. If you or someone that you know is in need of mental health support, I have a list of global mental health resources linked down below. Yes, life is incredibly hard. All of this stuff does not make it any easier, but we truly do not have to go at it alone or completely unequipped. If you need help, please reach out. Thank you for being here, and remember, nolite te bastardes carborundorum. Don't let the bastards drag you down.